It's really wonderful to be part of this. I'm deeply honored to be part of these proceedings, and I'm very grateful to you for launching this project. You and Michael together have done a real service, and I know all of us on this call and much beyond are grateful for what you're doing for 18th century ethics more broadly. So with that, thank you, Stefano and Michael, and thank you also to all of you on the call for being here. I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to be able to say a few words today about a thinker who's become of intense interest to me lately, Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson, it seems to me, is just one of the most interesting and indeed one of the most enigmatic of the early 18th century ethicists. And I say enigmatic for a very specific reason, and one that has to do with how I and many other scholars in my generation, especially, were introduced to Hutcheson. Like many scholars of the Scottish Enlightenment, I was introduced to Hutcheson as, quote unquote, Francis Hutcheson, father of the Scottish Enlightenment. We owe that particular term, that moniker, so far as I can tell, to Gladys Bryson's 1945 sort of pioneering study of Scottish social theory. But it's had a remarkable afterlife, and almost every sort of biographical overview of Hutcheson begins and uses it as its point of departure even today. Look up such things as even the Encyclopedia Britannica article that my students have brought to my attention takes it as its point of departure. There's good reasons to call Francis Hutcheson the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. He stands at the headwaters of the philosophical movement that would develop in mid-century. He had, as is very well known, an important philosophical correspondence with Hume at the time of the publication of the early stages of the treatise. His star undergraduate was no less than Adam Smith, who went on to succeed him at Glasgow at his alma mater as the professor of moral philosophy. And so for all those reasons, there's clear reasons to think that he is indeed rightly called father of the Scottish Enlightenment. But in a really genuinely deep sense, Hutcheson belongs to a quite different world, I think, than the philosophers of the later Scottish Enlightenment. And what I hope to do today is to present actually two very specific reasons for why one might think this. And the first reason has to do with the origins and foundations of Hutcheson's early moral philosophy. So Hutcheson is renowned today for, among many other ideas, especially the concept of disinterested benevolence. And there's good reasons why he's known for this particular concept. But what I want to show, one of the things I want to argue, is that Hutcheson's original interest is not, in fact, disinterested benevolence, but in fact was disinterested love. And this comes out especially clearly, I think, in the first edition of Hutcheson's first major philosophical work. This is the Inquiry into the Original of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue that appeared in its first edition in 1725. And there, disinterested love, in fact, plays a quite central role. It does not, however, play nearly so central a role in later editions of the text, nor does it play almost any role whatsoever in Hutcheson's later major philosophical publications. And so one of the things I want to try and do in the talk, and is a real focus of the longer paper on which the talk is based, is try and offer something of a hypothesis as to just why Hutcheson made this shift from an explicit focus on disinterested love in the first edition of 1725, what we call the A edition, and why exactly he shifted to the concept of disinterested benevolence, starting especially with the third edition, or the C edition, of 1729. As I say, that's a major part of the longer project. But for this talk in particular, I want to especially focus not as much on the reasons why, though I will acknowledge these as to why I think he may have made this change, but really to focus on the original origins of the concept in the first edition, and even to offer something of a hypothesis on the possible origins of the very concept of disinterested love that plays such a role in the 1725 inquiry. Because this origin, I think, lies in a set of debates that we don't often associate with the Scottish Enlightenment. And on these grounds, I think we have a first reason to rethink something of the idea of Hutcheson as the father of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. Put simply, I think that, I mean, I have a couple of challenges to the idea of identifying him as the father, one of which is by emphasizing him as a father, it makes him seem as if that particular moniker makes it seem as if the children are more important than the father. And even as a scholar of Adam Smith, I'm not sure that that's entirely fair. But the more important fact is that I think that by emphasizing him as the father, it ignores the fact that the father had a philosophical patrimony of his own. And this philosophical patrimony lies in some sources that are far distant from what we tend to think of when we think of the Scottish Enlightenment. And today I'm going to try and point to two sources in particular, both of which are traceable to very specific debates within 17th century moral theology. And I want to get those on the table and make a case for their importance for Hutcheson, but also through Hutcheson for the broader Scottish Enlightenment. And I will say parenthetically that a separate interest of mine that's very related to this talk today is a paper that I just finally made good on and submitted to Aaron Garrett, who is editing an Oxford Handbook on Enlightenment philosophy, that also traces on a more political level and especially an economic level, some of these connections between 17th century French moral theology and the political economy of the Scottish Enlightenment. There, the focus is on the question specifically of poverty. Here, the question is very specifically focused on disinterested love, but I only want to mention that to say that this is part of a broader project that's working its way out in a couple of different discrete pockets, different articles and chapters I'm working on, that's been trying to make some connections between 17th century French moral theology, and especially the work of Fenelon, and and some of the classical concerns of the social theory and the political economy of the Scottish Enlightenment. But all that's to say that the first major thing that I want to focus on in the talk is indeed this first reason for rethinking Hutcheson as the father, and to look specifically at the origins of his concept of disinterested love. But I also want to do something else in the talk that goes beyond its formal title, but also connects to this central question of Hutcheson as the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. And so about midway through, I want to pivot to another side of Hutcheson and to turn from his first publication to, quite frankly, his last, and indeed the very end of his last publication. So about midway through, I'm going to shift emphasis from the inquiry of 1725 to turn to his system of moral philosophy that was published posthumously in 1755. Because in the system, and specifically in its conclusion, Hutcheson presents a set of ideas that, again, not only seem distant from, but in many ways run decidedly counter to some of the broad themes within Scottish social theory that we would come to associate very soon afterwards with Hume and Smith and Ferguson and Kames, among many others. Here, at the end of the system, Hutcheson, in his final chapter, presents some strikingly pessimistic ideas with regard to practical philosophy and especially political philosophy. The one that I want to concentrate on especially is his concept that states have, as he says, within them, the inevitable seeds of their dissolution and destruction. And this is extremely interesting to me as a scholar specifically of the history of political philosophy, as well as a scholar of moral philosophy. Here, though, given our context, I'm going to try and restrain myself to focusing specifically on how Hutcheson's concerns are both palpably present here, but also how this pessimism, this palpable pessimism, distances him from so much later talk of progress within the Scottish Enlightenment. I think that this strong focus on the inevitable death of all social orders sits very uneasily next to this familiar Scottish talk. And so I want to use the second half of the talk to look again at this concluding chapter and hopefully give a second reason to believe that Hutcheson is at once not easily summarized as the father of so much that would come after, but also hopefully to make a case that he's much more interesting and complex if we see him in his own right rather than through that particular lens. So With that in mind, let me start with the first of the two topics here on the table, and that is Hutcheson's use of the concept of disinterested love. And given the fact that we tend to associate, as I mentioned, Hutcheson with disinterested benevolence rather than disinterested love, I want to start by just noting its presence, the presence of this concept in his writings. Because in the inquiry, Hutcheson not only frequently invokes disinterested love, but in fact does so in conjunction with a number of his signature claims. And I think it deserves to be brought to the fore, since this is not often discussed in the specialist scholarship. And so with that in mind, I think everybody has access now to the PDF that's been put in the chat. It's a handout with simply a number of the quotations that I'd like to work through here. I won't read most of those, but I think I will read these first three short bullet points under point number 1 on the handout. Because here we just simply see three of the places in which he uses the concept of disinterested love to bolster his foundational claims. And so in the first, this is from Inquiry 227, a Manichaean evil God is a notion which men would as readily run into as that of a good one, if there is no excellence in disinterested love, and no being acts but for its own advantage. So here's one of the places where we first see the concept, and here he's using it very specifically to buttress his central thematic claim about God's goodness. A second one comes out slightly later. This is 255. Quote, men have by nature a moral sense of goodness in actions, and they are capable of disinterested love. This is simply a very strict empirical claim. He's making an is claim about human nature. But what's important for my purposes is that this is specifically a claim about human nature and the centrality of the principle of disinterested love within it, and specifically our capability of disinterested love. Third and finally, just for right now, for starters, this is from 2315 in the inquiry. And here he uses some very striking language here. Quote, not that we can be truly virtuous if we intend only to obtain the pleasure which accompanies beneficence without the love of others. Nay, this very pleasure is founded on our being conscious of disinterested love to others as the spring of our actions. And so, read in context of the larger argument of the inquiry, Hutcheson here is now linking disinterested love to one of his fundamental claims for the entire project, which is the fact that we have within our nature an antecedent source of the pleasures that accompany beneficent action. And this is very important, as we'll talk about soon, in terms of his strategy of defanging Mandeville, this idea, and the other self-love theorists, the idea that we do all that we do simply for the sake of the pleasure that comes from it. Hutcheson's constant references to the idea that we have, in fact, an antecedent principle within us that operates without concern, without calculated rational concern for possible future pleasure. And here he's very directly saying that this antecedent source is, in fact, disinterested love. So I say all of this simply to get on the table some evidence from the start that Hutcheson used and drew on this concept of disinterested love, and that it played a quite key role in some of his central claims. Also clear from this, I think, is what he meant by it. And he meant something very direct by the very term disinterested love. Disinterested love is, as its name suggests, the love that is free from any trace of self-interest or self-love. And this means, again, as I just mentioned with regard to this question of antecedency, this means that disinterested love is impervious to all calculations of interest. And so, among other things, it is primary within us. It has a certain lexical priority, but it also can't be affected by concerns of either rational calculation or will. Now, all of that, I think, is evident enough, even from these three quotations, just from the surface of the text. But two other points are, I think, much less evident and take a little work to work through. One concerns how he came to this concept of disinterested love, and another concerns just why he was so invested in it to continually invoke it. And I think the second point can be fairly readily answered, especially when we think of the context in which the 1725 inquiry appeared. On the title page of the first edition, Hutcheson presented his inquiry very explicitly as an intervention in the famous debate, of course, between Shaftesbury and Mandeville. And the key question in that debate, as Hutcheson meant to signal from the title page onward, concerned human nature and specifically the ubiquity of self-love and whether, in fact, all moral action could be ultimately traced specifically to self-loving origins. Hutcheson's contribution, of course, was to defend Shaftesbury's understanding of virtue in the face of Mandeville's very reductive ethical egoism. Mandeville, who had traced all moral behavior to these self-interested motives without exception, Hutcheson wants to push back against this. And what he seems to have recognized is that even a single exception to the rule would, in fact, defang Mandeville's strong reductive claims. And so at least one of the things he seems to have found in the concept of disinterested love was precisely this sort of exception, which he thinks Mandeville was unable to account for. And so one of the ways we see him using disinterested love in the first A edition especially was in fact to defang Mandeville as part of a sort of if-then statement. And so he sets this forth in two different steps. And so if you look at number 2 on the handout here, and I won't read all of these passages, but here in the first passage, Hutcheson essentially lays out the challenge, the if challenge. If it can be made to appear that none, and by that I take it he means not one, of these affections which we call virtuous spring from self-love, etc., that is, if he can prove that there are, in fact, moral motives and moral actions that are not directly traceable to self-love, then he thinks that there's significant consequences for the legitimacy of Mandeville's argument. And he goes on later to present this in terms of the then statement that summarizes the argument. And here I'm condensing this argument across inquiry 2.2 into just this if-then set of statements. But if you see in the second paragraph there, the second passage under 2, he lays out here that the idea, having removed these false springs of virtuous actions, let us next establish the true one, that is, some determination of our nature to study the good of others, or some instinct antecedent to all reason from interest, which influences to the love of others. This love, then, is antecedent to the conjunction of interest, and the cause of it, not the effect. This love must then be disinterested. So, all I want to do is condense this to the essential claim here, this idea that the existence of the antecedent principle that he is here associating with disinterested love serves to defang, he thinks, Mandeville's arguments, the strong reductive arguments about universality of self-love. Now, a great deal more, of course, can be said about this argument and its philosophical sufficiency. But all I hope to have established now is why Hutcheson might have been so attracted to the idea of disinterested love in the first place. What I think remains to be explained, though, is how exactly Hutcheson came to this idea, and I'll put it in terms of again, a question word, of where exactly Hutcheson might have been exposed to this concept. My strong suspicion, I'm going to try and present the evidence for this now, is that Hutcheson very likely took this concept from either or both of two very specific sources. One source is British and one source is French. The first source, the British source, is the Cambridge Platonist Henry More. And so More is known, and indeed his influence on the Scottish Enlightenment is known in practical ethics, for his Enchiridion Ethicum. And there, among other things that he discusses, is of course, the intellectual love of God. But More would develop the concept of love in several other writings. And for our purposes right now, the most important of these is a set of 3 letters that he composed in the 1670s. And these are letters of striking interest that would have a remarkably wide circulation throughout the 18th century. And so the letters, so far as I've been able to tell, were first published in 1708 under the tract of 2 letters on self-love. Those 2 letters were republished in addition to a 3rd letter in 1710 in the biography of More written by Richard Ward. The letters were published as an appendix. I mention this because here we have 2 very quick instances in 1708 and 1710, But the letters would continue to be republished throughout the 18th century, especially in Scotland, and indeed as late as 1756, they would be republished by the famous Foulis Press in Glasgow. And the Foulis title is especially noteworthy. Foulis published these letters under the title, An Essay on Disinterested Love in a Letter to Bishop Stillingfleet. Now, I think this title is noteworthy because it's wrong on at least three different counts. Number one, what Foulis called an essay was, of course, not an essay, but in fact a letter. Number two, the addressee that Foulis identifies for the letter is not, in fact, Stillingfleet, but a London rector named Richard Sherlock. And while I know this seems like a little bit of inside baseball, there was a really brilliant piece, a wonderful piece of detective work published in Notes and Queries just last year in 2024 by, I believe, an Oxford graduate student named Jacob Chatterjee, which made this this very convincing case that it was in fact Sherlock who was the addressee. It's one of the best pieces I've seen in Notes and Queries for some time. I really would commend it to you if this is at all of interest. But I want to move beyond that question to third and most importantly. The third error of the Foulis title, when they call it an essay on disinterested love, is that in the letter, More himself never uses the actual term disinterested love. He uses another term, and it has to be said, a decidedly infelicitous term. The term that he uses is a quote unquote unself-interested love. And so he uses this term throughout his letters, those three letters. But I've just isolated one particular quotation here under the third passage on the handout, in which we have this reference, which he himself admits is infelicitous, quote, which I cannot call by a better or more compendious name than an unself-interested love. What's interesting about this, I think, given the wide penetration of these letters, and given the fact that Hutcheson himself had a very demonstrable interest in More himself, Hutcheson's admiration for More is prominent in several places, but most explicitly in the glowing preface that he wrote to the edition of More's Divine Dialogues that would be published in the 1730s. Hutcheson, we think, was both the editor as well as the introducer of those dialogues, and his interest in More is quite obvious there. But what I suspect he's interested in is specifically More's concept of unself-interested love, for the very reason that he would have found in it exactly the sort of resource that he himself is finding in his own position on disinterested love. That is, More's concept of unself-interested love, as you can see from handout 3 passage, as well as many other passages, is that this unself-interested love is specifically a natural principle that resists self-love. And I think that this would have been of obvious interest to Hutcheson, and he would have recognized the degree to which it would have assisted him in his arguments, his counter-Mandevillian arguments. That said, I do think that that More is only one of two, and perhaps not even the most important of the two possible sources from which Hutcheson likely drew the concept. There's another likely source, I think an even more likely source, and this source is none other than the great Fenelon, who is not uncoincidentally a subject of a great deal of my research for the past several years. Fenelon himself developed the concept of disinterested love in the context of the famous pure amour debates with his one-time mentor Bossuet in the late 1690s. Now, it should be said that other concepts of disinterested love circulated across Europe. Much earlier in the century, several French Catholic mystics had developed the concept up to Madame Guyon, who was such an important figure in the pure amour debates. But also Leibniz is simultaneously developing his own concept in a number of writings from the 1670s that are not, however, circulating nearly so widely and certainly not being published across Europe. They're mostly coming in the forms of letters and occasional pieces. So it turns out to be by far Fenelon who has the greatest penetration across Europe in the 18th century, and especially in Britain, with regard to the concept of disinterested love. And in some sense, the penetration's not surprising. Fenelon's novel Telemachus, which remains, I think, his best known writing. This book had remarkably wide penetration throughout Europe. The fun fact that Fenelon scholars like to remind the rest of the world is that the book was often thought to be the most read and best-selling book after the Bible in all of 18th century France. And in my monograph on Fenelon, I do a roll call on the first page of all the major Enlightenment luminaries who pay their respects to Fenelon. That's a way of saying, though, that Fenelon's political thought, and to some degree his moral philosophy, is well known throughout Europe. What is less well appreciated, but deserves appreciation, is the equal degree of penetration of his moral theology. And Fenelon's love concept in particular would be important throughout Britain, and especially in Scotland at the high point of the Scottish Enlightenment. So just to mention again the famous Foulis Press of Glasgow, in 1765, at the height of what we think of as the Scottish Enlightenment, at the time when Adam Smith is giving his lectures on jurisprudence here at Glasgow, the Foulis Press publishes one of Fenelon's mystical treatises on love. And the fact that we find the Foulis Press, frankly, in Presbyterian Glasgow, publishing this French Catholic Archbishop's mystical treatise on divine love is really, I think, a question, raises all kinds of interesting questions about what may have been happening. I'm going to restrict myself just to the point here that that was hardly an outlier, because all throughout the early decades of the 18th century, there were numerous English publications, English language publications of Fenelon's letters on divine love circulating in London and Dublin and in Scotland here. For our purposes, I'm going to limit myself very strictly to the first of these translated texts, which was Fenelon's explication of the maxims of the saints. This was a 1697 contribution to the pure love debates. It was Fenelon's most important text in which he outlined his concept of pure love and its consonance with the teachings of the Church Fathers. And here, and it was translated just a year later into English and widely disseminated in London in 1698. Here, Fenelon's aim, again, is to demonstrate the reality of the pure love of God, and indeed to demonstrate the capabilities of human beings to experience a divine love free from all concern for self. And again, I've condensed a number of passages in the longer paper just to the fourth handout piece, in which we see that there is Fenelon's commitment to this idea in the English translation now of a quote-unquote fully disinterested love that exists, quote, without mixture of any other motive than that of only loving God in himself and for himself. Again, I think it's obvious that Hutcheson would have been interested in the concept, and it's also the case that he knew Fenelon's work quite well and cites explicitly his arguments for the existence of God, both in his metaphysical writings, and he also cites in his translation of Marcus Aurelius here. As I say, in the longer version of the paper, I go into much more detail on Fenelon's concept. What I want to do here, though, is simply make the case that Hutcheson seems to be very consciously appropriating a concept from 17th century moral theology for his own moral philosophical purposes. Now, the challenge is that Fenelon quickly got into somewhat hot water for this. And so here's the part of the story as to why we don't think of Fenelon as a theorist specifically of disinterested love. In the immediate wake of the publication of the first volume, or the first edition of the Inquiry, Hutcheson was subjected to a number of very published critiques. These critiques are somewhat well known today, even at least among specialists. And two in particular that I would mention is the 1726 critique of John Clarke of Hull and the 1728 critique of Archibald Campbell. I won't go into the details of these critiques at any length, They're both fascinating, and Clark's is important especially for the degree to which he seeks to criticize Hutcheson from the standpoint of Christian orthodoxy. He says that Hutcheson is, quote unquote, contrary to Christian revelation and, quote unquote, destructive of Christian religion. At a time when the Committee on the Purity of Doctrine in the Church of Scotland was investigating several people close to Hutcheson, this, of course, raised some significant eyebrows. But Clark's main critique is that Hutcheson's argument is not philosophical enough, and what he hones in upon is precisely the lack of philosophical sophistication of his invocation of the concept of disinterested love. And so while scholars going back to at least Luigi Turco's very fine article at the turn of the 21st century in BJHP have attended to Clark's critiques, what hasn't been focused on as much is the fact that Clark's critique very largely focused on the concept of, or Hutcheson's use of disinterested love. And again, I won't read the passage, but here's one representative passage under number 5. Clark's critique is that indeed, this concept is very unphilosophical, quote unquote, and Hutcheson, in invoking this concept, confounds love, which is merely a quote unquote affection of the mind, with the actions flowing from it. Now, this is one critique. A second critique also comes up with Campbell, who in 1728 publishes this text that he wasn't known for in the beginning. It's a fascinating text unto itself. It's published in 1728 as the Arete Logia. It is in fact published under the name of a man named Alexander Innes. Innes was a fellow Scot in London to whom Campbell had entrusted his manuscript, and Innes very promptly completely plagiarized it and just had it published with slapping his own name on the title page. It's a total fabrication, and so it wasn't until 1733 that Campbell would ultimately publish this in his own name. In any case, the claim is the same, that Hutcheson's use of the concept of disinterested love is not just problematic, but it is completely an empty set that fails to explain anything substantive at all. Again, much could be said about the sophistication of these philosophical arguments. What I want to focus on is the specific fact that Hutcheson would take these to heart. And so, as is well known, his other major philosophical publication of 1728, this is the Essay with Illustrations, takes Clark as his point of departure. But what's even more interesting to me is that in the 1729 C, or third edition revisions of the Inquiry, Hutcheson dramatically downplays the concept of disinterested love, almost to the effect of extricating it from his argument altogether. And what he does specifically is substitute the language of disinterested benevolence for disinterested love. And this comes out especially in the changes he makes to Inquiry 223, which is an incredibly important heavy lifting passage where he talks about the love of benevolence and the love of complacence. And in fact, in ways that Michael Walschatz has called very important attention to in his recent piece in Ergo. But for our purposes, the important claim is that Hutcheson excises his most important claims about disinterested love and substitutes a very long new section, 14 pages in the printed C edition, under a new heading, quote unquote, the marginal heading reads, quote unquote, benevolence is disinterested. And here now the focus is on disinterested benevolence and other proxies for this antecedent love. And so I've included under handout 8 the particular claim as a sort of the summary that he makes at the end of his long section, these 14 pages, in which he tells us that, quote, from the whole it may appear that there is in human nature a disinterested ultimate desire of the happiness of others. Here, Hutcheson is moving far away from the early claims about disinterested love per se, and is using a different a placeholder with this much more open-ended concept of this disinterested ultimate desire of the happiness of others. What I think is happening is that this enables him to preserve the point he's most interested in and invested in, the idea that we have an antecedent concern for the well-being of others without getting involved in the love debates because of what was prompted and the ways in which those had resonance. Another piece of resonance, which I won't read out, but I passed over number 7 on the handout. Chambers' Cyclopedia also comes out in 1728, also giving disinterested love a bad name by associating it with all of these problematic mystics and quietists. So for all of these reasons, I think that he pivoted away and recognized that he got more of what he wanted with disinterested benevolence than disinterested love. I emphasize this again, to go back to the very beginning of the talk, for the reason that this suggests that that Hutcheson finds his original concepts, the original grounds of some of his most fundamental concerns in these moral theological debates of the 17th century, and especially for the French 17th century, and that this suggests something of a difference with some of the ways we associate him with the later Scottish Enlightenment. That said, I want now to make a sharp pivot here and to use my remaining time, and I promise I won't, Stefano mentioned going no more than about 50 minutes, and I will stay under those polls. But having started, I think it's 7:10, that gives me maybe about 10 or so minutes still. I'd like to shift to another side of Hutcheson's argument that, again, distances him, I think, from the Scottish Enlightenment. And this is the one that comes out in what I'm calling his political pessimism. This pessimism I've been extremely struck by in a variety of places, especially his discussions of modern corruption. I'm going to leave those to the side in the interest of time and focus just very directly on the concluding chapter of his System of Moral Philosophy, and this is System 311. And the subject of 311 is the quote-unquote duration of the political union. And here, as in other places, he's quite consciously following Pufendorf. And so Hutcheson's system, as is well appreciated, is modeled on and follows the order of Pufendorf's law of nature and nations here. Pufendorf's final chapter also ends with the question of the dissolution of the Commonwealth. What's entirely unprecedented in Pufendorf is the specific note that Hutcheson takes care to end on: pessimism. Hutcheson introduces this conclusion now, this very surprising and unconventional conclusion, in a quite unsurprising and very conventional way. And specifically, he begins by emphasizing providentialism, and especially the wise ordering of nature for man's benefit. And so I actually put these quotations, and I've kept them much longer actually here, but they're on the second part of the handout that I actually put a page break in. But you'll see them starting with number 9, I hope, under what I've called Hutcheson's optimism. Here, Hutcheson provides a very conventional statement for him and for many in the period of Providence's ordering of inward sentiment for maximum benefit. What I'm interested in here is the fact that he ends this conventionally optimistic sentiment on the ways in which we've been natured for flourishing on a quite dark note. And so he makes this caveat and introduces this darker note right at the end of 311.4. And in here, I'm just going to go through the italicized passage, that he makes the qualification that nature has ordered our sentiments for flourishing, but only, quote, the noblest internal enjoyments and the greatest external advantages and pleasures, which the unstable condition of terrestrial affairs will admit. Now, this is an interesting caveat, and he develops what he means in the remainder of the text. And his first move in what immediately follows is to introduce a distinction between two types of happiness. And this comes out in handout 10. The first and most stable is what he calls the quote unquote only solid foundation of rest and tranquility and joy. The other is that of those deceived by quote unquote false hopes. This is those who imagine a quote unquote external happiness. And his claim here is that this external happiness of both states and individuals is unavailable because of the ephemerality of external things. That is, the quote, transitory, changeable, and perishing nature of everything external, end quote. Now, all of this is familiar enough from very basic Platonism and Neoplatonism, the ephemerality of changing being. But Hutcheson goes further, and he uses this metaphysical claim to make a very strong ethical and political claim. And specifically, he makes a claim about how we ought to understand the state in light of it. And thus, in this remarkable passage in Handout 11, I think the only one of the remaining ones that I will actually read, if you don't mind, he makes this claim that, quote, states have within themselves the seeds of death and destruction. What in the temerity, imprudence, or superstitions of the first contrivers? What in the selfish, ambitious, or the meaner passions of the governors and their subjects, jarring with each other and among themselves? What in the oppositions of those seeming interests which such passions pursue? What in the weakness and inconstancy of human virtues, and in the proneness of men to luxury and pleasant pleasures without attention to the consequences? These seeds, along with external force and jarring national interests, have always occasioned the dissolution and death of every body politic, and will occasion it as certainly as the internal weakness of the animal body and external causes will at last bring it to its fatal period, end quote. Now, this is both a stylistically and I think substantively remarkable passage, and I want to emphasize two aspects. One is his forthright and pronounced emphasis on the inevitability and the necessity of dissolution. This is the repeated language. States have always fallen in the past. They certainly will do so in the future. And indeed, he reiterates this in the very last line of the book, this necessity. That said, before going there, I also want to note a second striking element of this third passage, or this passage that's under number 11. Namely, that Hutcheson here actually gives a quite detailed and sophisticated analysis of the causes of dissolution of states. And by my count, Hutcheson points to no less than 7 discrete causes of dissolution, which he groups into 2 categories. One category involves what we might call external causes, and Hutcheson points to 2 very specific ones. One is the quote-unquote external force of rival nations, by which I take it he means military force. And the second is the quote-unquote jarring interests among nations, by which I take it he means both commercial and diplomatic tensions. But the second category involves what we might call internal causes, and here he points to 5. 1, imprudence of founders. 2, the selfishness of governors and citizens today. 3rd, the division endemic to faction and competition. 4th, the weakness of virtue. And 5th, the corruptions of luxury. To my mind, this is a really remarkable list and contains within it an entire political theory of decline and fall. And one of the things I'm hoping is that in the wake of the soon-to-be released new edition of the system, as some of you may know, Knut Hutcheson and Christian Maurer are soon to release in the Liberty Fund's Natural Law and Enlightenment Classics series, as one of that last volumes in that concluding series, a new edition of the system. And I'm hoping that more attention will be given to Hutcheson's political thought, which is almost entirely ignored to this point. Without saying more there, I only want to say that I hope that as we start attending to Hutcheson's politics, that we might see him as a more sophisticated political theorist, and especially one with really profound insight into the causes of degeneration and corruption, which I think he also bequeathed to some degree to his student Adam Smith, at least as I tried to argue in an article published earlier this year. Leaving Smith aside, though, what I want to end with is by turning to Hutcheson's account of the proper response to these seeds that are implanted inevitably in states. And so one point worth emphasizing, especially given my focus on Fenelon in the first half of the talk, is that Hutcheson was no advocate of quietism. He's very explicit in saying, in a part that I don't quote on the handout, the quote-unquote, good men should not be passive. That is, they should work to, quote, ward off and delay this corruption and dissolution. But his encouragement of this is really quite tempered. And indeed, he goes on to insist, quote, but he must think little of the order of nature, who sees not that all our efforts will be defeated at last. Now, With this, Hutcheson drives home his key point, which concerns this inevitable decline and fall. And in the end, it's not only states, but individuals who must necessarily decline, fall, and die. And so he gives two very remarkable portraits of this decline and fall in his following two passages. And I won't reproduce these in the interest of time, but you can see on handout 12 his striking statement about the fall of empires, and in handout 13 his statement about the vanity and futility of external things. I find these really to be remarkable rhetorical masterpieces, with Hutcheson really pulling out all of the stops. But without reading them in full, what I want to emphasize is the emphasis on infinitude that is so prominent there. Specifically, his claim is that the duration of the lives of both men and empires is vanishingly fleeting. In both cases, the insignificant lives of both states and individual men are bounded on each side by an infinitude of the past and an infinitude of the future. Now, in emphasizing this, Hutcheson is going well beyond conventional Republican narratives of civic decline, and indeed beyond conventional moralistic narratives of memento mori and such things. To my mind, this emphasis on the boundless infinitude of past and present and the vanishingly thin current state, this strikes me as a quite Pascalian note, and perhaps even more than a Pascalian note, what we might recognize as an Augustinian note. And indeed, in the next and final paragraph of the work, Hutcheson ends with the central Augustinian distinction. And if you look in handout 14, he invokes the core Augustinian distinction of the two cities and tells us, quote, "Let us trust in him and be doing good after his example. And as we see that all states and cities upon earth are unstable, tottering, and presently fall into ruins, let us look for one that hath a solid foundation, eternal in the heavens, whose builder and maker is God." And so here now we see, I think, where all of Hutcheson's emphasis on the ephemerality of states and empires has been heading. The goal seems to be to effect a shift in the reader, to refocus the reader's eyes away from the city of man to the city of God. There's a lot here baked into that, but at the very least, I would suggest that he's pointing somewhere very different from where many of the later Scottish social theorists who would follow in his wake were going to head. And in particular, it brings his political philosophy back around to his moral philosophy. And here's the note that I'd like to end on. That is, in debunking this false happiness of the world, Hutcheson returns his reader to the question of true happiness. And this question is central, in fact, to the system and indeed his project as a whole, and really returns us to the core theme of love at the heart of this talk. I open the hour, of course, by invoking what I take to be Hutcheson's underappreciated sense of the prominence of divine love. And as it turns out, I think the question of Hutcheson's political pessimism returns us to this same question of divine love. For in debunking the false happiness of the external world, Hutcheson returns to the question of what he calls throughout the system the quote-unquote supreme happiness of nature. And he tells us in a much earlier passage, and this is the last passage on the handout 15, in what exactly supreme happiness consists. And he tells us, and again, I won't read the whole, but "'Tis plain our supreme and complete happiness, according to the universal doctrine of the wisest men in all ages, must consist in the complete exercise of these nobler virtues, especially that entire love and resignation to God." And so the fact that this supreme happiness of man consists not in external pleasures, but the entire love of God, I think is significant for at least two reasons. One is the degree to which it points again to more daylight between Hutcheson's social theory and the broader social theory that often is he's seen as the father of, but also more substantively from the standpoint of his own project, his political theory seems to bring him back around to his moral theory here and suggests that the limits of politics require us to attend once again to the supreme happiness that we have been natured, as it were, for. And his claim fundamentally and consistently, however it's expressed throughout his writings, that divine love is in fact both the mark of our nature and the end or telos of our being. And to say only the very least, the idea that divine love is the mark of our nature and the end or telos of our being is not an idea that we tend to associate with the Scottish Enlightenment, at least of Hume and Smith. And so with that, I think I'll conclude, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.